At my husband's funeral, my son thanked another woman, while I sat in the back like a guest at my own life. The woman smiled proudly, dressed in black like she owned the day. Later, the lawyer said my husband left everything to her, our house, our savings, even the beach home I helped build. My son didn't look shocked. He already knew. They both thought I was finished, a forgotten wife with nothing left. But what they didn't know was that I had a second will locked away, and once I opened that folder, everything they built together started to fall apart. The church smelled of lilies and polished wood, filled with whispers that floated like smoke. I sat quietly near the back, holding my gloves in my lap. My husband's casket stood at the front, surrounded by flowers I didn't choose. Every glance passed over me, as if I were a stranger. My son, Ethan, stood straight and confident at the podium, speaking about his father's strength and kindness. I waited for him to mention me, even once, but his voice moved on without pause, and I realized I was not part of the story he was telling. When Ethan said he wanted to thank a special person, my heart stirred. I thought it might finally be me, the woman who stood beside his father through every storm. But then he said her name, Sabrina Cole. The crowd turned toward a woman in the front row, wearing a black dress, her makeup perfect, her smile soft and practiced. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and nodded politely. Around me, people murmured. I watched her place a hand over her heart, and my own heart felt like it had stopped beating for a second. Sabrina looked elegant and calm, the kind of composure that only comes from knowing you've already won. Her eyes never once met mine, yet everything in her posture told me she knew who I was. My son stepped down from the podium and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, the way a child would comfort family. I watched them together, and a quiet ache spread through me. 40 years of marriage reduced to a passing moment, and my only child treating a stranger as if she carried more worth than the woman who raised him. When the ceremony ended, guests moved towards Sabrina like iron to a magnet. They offered condolences, kind words, and gentle touches. To them, she was the grieving partner. I stood near the entrance, offering small nods to those who remembered my name. Most didn't. A few whispered about how modern love worked in complicated ways. I smiled faintly, holding back everything that wanted to escape. Sabrina accepted every word as if it were meant for her, and I realized she wasn't just at the funeral, she had positioned herself at the center of my husband's legacy. Ethan guided her out of the church while people followed behind, leaving me standing by the casket. I touched its edge lightly, tracing the polished wood. The man inside had once promised I'd never have to worry about anything. I had believed him. Outside, the wind picked up and scattered flower petals across the ground. I stood alone, wondering if this was what loyalty earned, a quiet seat in the back and a forgotten name. Still, I told myself to hold my head high. Dignity was all I had left, and I wasn't about to lose that too. When I returned home, the house felt colder than usual. His coat still hung by the door, the sleeves limp and empty. I set down my purse on the same table where we once left birthday cards, bills, and grocery lists. Everything looked untouched, yet hollow. In the kitchen, 2 mugs waited by the sink, one still marked with his last coffee stain. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. For 40 years, I had made sure this home never fell apart, and now it belonged to a woman who had never spent a night in it. That evening, I received a call from the lawyer's office. The will would be read the next morning. The voice on the other end sounded formal and detached. I asked if Sabrina Cole would be there, and the answer was yes. My hand tightened around the phone. It was almost midnight, but I couldn't sleep. I walked through each room, touching the furniture, the curtains, the framed photos. Every object carried a memory I could not erase. I knew that tomorrow would not be about grief anymore. It would be about exposure, about learning just how deep the lies went. Morning came gray and damp. I dressed in a plain navy suit, the one I used to wear when I handled financial meetings with my husband before he said I didn't need to work anymore. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone older, quieter, but not broken. When I arrived at the law office, Ethan and Sabrina were already there, sitting side by side. She looked composed, holding a small black handbag in her lap. Ethan avoided my eyes, staring instead at the window. I took a seat across from them, my heart steady but guarded. The lawyer entered, a tall man with a cautious expression. He greeted everyone briefly, then opened a thick folder on the desk. His voice was calm and rehearsed as he began reading. The will named Sabrina Cole as the primary heir to my husband's estate, our home, our accounts, even the coastal cottage I helped maintain every summer. I listened without a word, though my stomach felt hollow. Each sentence felt like another piece of my life being handed to someone else. When the lawyer finished, Sabrina smiled faintly and folded her hands like the queen of the room. Ethan stood and shook the lawyer's hand. He didn't seem surprised by any of it. I realized he already knew. The realization hurt more than losing the money. My son, the boy I raised with my own hands, had chosen them over me. Sabrina rose from her chair and thanked the lawyer politely before turning to leave. She didn't even glance in my direction. The room felt heavier as the door shut behind them. I remained seated, staring at the folder on the desk. The paper inside it had erased me, but it also gave me a reason to fight. I drove home through light rain, each traffic light blurred in the drizzle, and every familiar corner looked unfamiliar. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt larger than before, almost foreign. I sat in the car for a moment, thinking of how everything I built was now written under another woman's name. I went inside, hung my wet coat, and stood in the hallway. The air was quiet, but not peaceful. It felt like a space waiting for judgment. I walked to our bedroom and opened the closet. His shirts hung neatly, untouched, like a display of deceit. I ran my fingers across the sleeves of his favorite jacket. It still smelled faintly of cologne. For a moment, I wanted to tear it down, to destroy everything connected to him, but I didn't. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My reflection showed faintly in the polished wood. I thought of how many times I had chosen patience over pride, silence over confrontation. Now silence had become my punishment. The room, once filled with laughter, now felt like a museum of my mistakes, each item an exhibit of misplaced trust. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the clock on the wall. The ticking seemed louder than usual. On the counter sat a stack of old bills, receipts, and letters. I flipped through them absent-mindedly, then paused when I saw one with Sabrina's name written on it. My chest tightened. It was an old business letter from years ago, a thank-you note from a property manager. The address listed was the beach house. I had thought that house belonged to us, but clearly, I was wrong. My husband had been building her future, not ours. I placed the letter on the table and looked around the kitchen that had once been my world. Every detail was something I had chosen. The curtains, the dishes, the color of the walls. Now each one mocked me. I realized I had been the caretaker of a life designed for someone else. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. If Sabrina wanted to pretend she had won, I would let her, for now. I had a feeling my husband's secrets ran deeper than anyone realized, and if that was true, there would be proof somewhere, waiting to be found. That night, I went through the study, opening drawers and boxes that had been untouched for years. Among old files, I found a locked metal folder I hadn't seen before. The key hung from the edge of his bookshelf, tied with a red ribbon. Inside were papers, signatures, and financial notes. Near the bottom, one document caught my eye. It had my husband's signature, but the date was different from the will read in court. I froze, realizing what it was. The original version, the real will. And with that discovery, everything that woman thought she controlled was about to unravel. I spread the papers across the table, reading through every line. My husband had left me everything in this version, signed and dated only months before the other one. The handwriting was his, unmistakable. There was even a witness signature from his longtime accountant. My hands trembled, but I felt a strange calm settling in. I realized that Sabrina must have somehow manipulated him into changing it later. She had planned it carefully, waited until he was weak, and taken everything. I wasn't sure how yet, but I knew this piece of paper would turn everything around. I called the accountant listed on the document. He had retired, but his number still worked. When I mentioned my husband's name, he paused. His tone changed. Careful but kind. He remembered the will and confirmed he had witnessed the signing himself. I asked if he had ever seen a second one. He hadn't. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone had created a replacement version and destroyed the truth. The old man told me to keep it safe. I thanked him quietly, feeling both relief and anger build together like slow heat inside me. I made a copy of the document and locked it in my drawer. The original went into a fireproof box in my closet. I didn't want to act too soon. If Sabrina or Ethan found out I had it, they might try to interfere. For now, I would play along. I needed to understand how far their deception had gone. That night, I sat in the living room and looked around at the house again. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt different. This was no longer just my home. It was now the scene of their betrayal. I began paying closer attention to everything Ethan said or did. He didn't visit much anymore, but when he did, he mentioned Sabrina often, always defending her kindness. He said she was helping organize the sale of the beach house, as if it were already hers. I listened quietly, nodding when needed. He didn't realize I already had the weapon that would undo them both. Every sentence he spoke only confirmed what I suspected. They had worked together, maybe unknowingly, to erase me from my own life. But I was still standing, and I had more patience than both. I needed guidance before making any move. I decided to meet an old friend, Ruth, who used to work with me back when I still had my job at the firm. She had always been sharp and unafraid to speak the truth. I told her I needed help reviewing something private. She agreed to meet the next afternoon. That night, I looked through old photos, remembering the woman I used to be before marriage consumed my name. I promised myself I would bring her back. Before we move forward with what happened next, please take a second to follow my story. Ruth welcomed me into her home with a warm smile and tea that smelled like lemon. She had aged gracefully, but her eyes were still keen, filled with quiet intelligence. When I laid the folder on her table, she leaned closer, scanning each line carefully. She looked up after a few minutes and said the signature and witness mark were completely valid. That meant the other will was the fake. She asked if I wanted to take legal action. I nodded. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about restoring my name and proving I wasn't the fool they imagined. Ruth promised to contact someone she knew from her old firm, someone who specialized in inheritance disputes. I left her house feeling lighter, almost hopeful. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had direction. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Ethan's car parked outside. He was waiting by the porch, arms crossed. His expression was tight. He said he came to check on me, but his tone felt rehearsed. I invited him in anyway, sensing there was another reason for his visit. When we sat down, I saw a message flash on his phone, Sabrina's name. Ethan started talking about how Sabrina had been feeling attacked by gossip. He asked me to avoid making things more difficult for everyone. He didn't know how close he was to revealing himself. I listened quietly, nodding while every word he said fueled my determination. It wasn't concern that brought him here. It was damage control. He wanted to make sure I wasn't planning to challenge the will. I realized then how much control Sabrina had over him. She had replaced both wife and mother in one lifetime, but she forgot that I was still breathing, still thinking, still planning. After Ethan left, I walked into my husband's study again. His desk still held little reminders of his habits, a broken pen, old receipts, a small crystal paperweight I gave him on our 10th anniversary. I sat in his chair and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were records from his company days. Among them was a letter from a property manager addressed to Sabrina Cole. It mentioned renovation plans for the beach house and her approval. My chest tightened. It was written years ago, long before my husband died. She hadn't only stolen his affection, she had been managing his assets behind my back. I stayed up all night reviewing documents. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. This affair wasn't new. It had been carefully built for years. Each transaction, each letter, and each business decision pointed toward her growing control. She had taken over slowly until everything that once belonged to us was redirected to her. The betrayal wasn't only emotional, it was strategic. She had planned to erase me from the start. I decided that exposing her would be more than revenge. It would be justice. She could take his affection, but she wouldn't take what was rightfully mine. The next day, I went to the town records office. I requested property files linked to Sabrina's name. The clerk looked surprised when I gave her the address of our beach home. She said that property had been transferred years ago under a company name, one that matched my husband's old business records. My heart sank as I realized he had used his own company to disguise ownership. He hadn't just betrayed me privately, he had used his professional network to make it official. I took copies of everything and walked out determined to piece together the full timeline. I drove to the beach house that afternoon. The gate was still locked, but I parked nearby and looked through the fence. It hadn't changed much. The same white walls, the same porch we once painted together, but now there were new flowers by the window, ones I had never planted. I saw a pair of sandals near the door, not mine. For a moment, I felt like a trespasser in my own memory. Standing there, I understood something important. This was no accident or emotional mistake. Sabrina had claimed my husband's life with full intention and careful calculation. When I returned home, I found another envelope on my doorstep. It was from the lawyer's office, containing an official transfer notice. Sabrina was planning to sell the house within weeks. I sat on the porch steps, reading it twice. My pulse stayed calm. I wouldn't rush. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into the same folder as the original will. If she wanted to sell what wasn't hers, she would face the truth in court. She had no idea her time was running out, and I wasn't about to warn her. I wanted her confident until the end. Over the next few days, I started documenting everything. Photos, letters, receipts, all sorted neatly into folders. Ruth helped me verify dates and cross-check information. We met almost every evening, drinking tea while the pieces came together. She said she hadn't seen such blatant manipulation in years. I smiled faintly. It wasn't just manipulation, it was theft disguised as devotion. I remembered the way Sabrina stood at the funeral, so sure of her place. I wanted her to feel that certainty shatter the way mine had. And this time, she would have an audience when the truth came out. I met Ruth again at a small cafe downtown. She had news. A contact from her old firm found irregular transfers from my husband's company into Sabrina's personal account. They were labeled as consulting fees. The total sum was large, too large to ignore. It explained how Sabrina afforded her polished life. I took a deep breath and told Ruth I was ready to move forward. She offered to arrange a meeting with a lawyer specializing in fraud. It was time to take everything I had and use it properly. The fight wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about evidence. At home, I began to feel a sense of control return. Every folder I prepared, every note I wrote down, gave me strength. I realized that silence had been my biggest mistake all those years. I had mistaken it for peace, but it was only permission for others to walk over me, not anymore. As I worked late into the night, I thought of how my husband once said I didn't need to worry about finances. Now I understood why. He didn't want me to see what he was doing, but he underestimated me, and that would be his legacy's undoing. The next morning, I met with Monica Patel, the lawyer Ruth recommended. She was direct, calm, and professional, the kind of person who didn't waste words. I handed her the folders. She went through each file quietly, marking notes with a pen. When she looked up, she said the case was strong. There were inconsistencies in the will dates, and the financial evidence pointed toward fraud. She explained how the process would go. I nodded, listening carefully. For the first time, I felt seen. Not as a widow or a victim, but as a woman ready to defend her life. We filed the initial notice the same week. Monica submitted copies of the will, property records, and bank transactions. I expected some hesitation, maybe fear, but instead I felt focused. The paperwork didn't just represent assets, it represented my years of unpaid labor, of quiet support, of building someone else's dream. Now those years had weight again. That night, I looked out the window and saw the lights from the neighbor's house. Life went on around me as if nothing had happened, but for me, everything was shifting. I had finally stepped out of the role they had written for me. Sabrina must have learned about the filing because the next morning she called me. Her tone was careful but confident. She spoke as if she were still in control. Asking why I was making things complicated, I didn't answer. I hung up before she could finish. The silence afterward felt clean, almost satisfying. I imagined her surprise on the other end, realizing I wasn't playing her game anymore. She had lived years believing I was harmless. That belief would cost her dearly now. Power, I realized, doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it only needs proof and patience. I informed Ethan that legal action had begun. He was furious. He accused me of destroying his father's reputation and making things worse for everyone. I didn't argue. I let him speak. Knowing truth would do the explaining for me soon enough. Watching him defend Sabrina felt like watching a stranger. I saw no trace of the boy I had raised, only a man shaped by lies. It hurt. But I also knew it wasn't permanent. Sooner or later, the truth always reaches those who run from it. My focus remained on one thing: bringing everything into the light. The legal process moved forward. Monica kept me informed at every step. We collected statements, financial records, and witness signatures. Each new piece of evidence painted the same story. Sabrina had manipulated both my husband and the documents. She had positioned herself to inherit everything long before his death. I learned that one of the notaries listed on her version of the will had been paid through her own account. That was the final piece we needed. The walls of her plan were beginning to crack, and I was ready to stand in court and watch them collapse completely. In preparation for the hearing, Monica suggested I practice giving a statement. I sat across from her, telling my story from the beginning. She listened closely, taking notes, adjusting details for clarity. Hearing it aloud made me realize how much I had endured: decades of silence, dismissal, and manipulation. When we finished, Monica smiled faintly and said my strength was my best evidence. That night, I slept without fear for the first time in months. The battle wasn't over, but the worst part, the helplessness, was gone. Whatever happened next, I would meet it head-on. No more pretending to be powerless. The court date was set. Word spread quickly through town. Old acquaintances reached out, curious but cautious. Some offered quiet encouragement, others avoided me entirely. I didn't care either way. The truth didn't need approval. The day before the hearing, I walked through my home one last time, taking note of every detail: the creaking stairs, the faint marks on the kitchen wall from Ethan's childhood drawings. I wasn't sure what would happen tomorrow, but I knew I was ready. This house had seen my pain, and now it would see my vindication. I whispered goodbye to my fear. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived early. Sabrina was already there, dressed in a tailored suit, pretending calm. Ethan sat beside her, avoiding my gaze. The judge entered, and everyone rose. I sat quietly, my hands folded on my lap. Monica began presenting our evidence: transaction records, letters, and the original will. Sabrina's lawyer tried to challenge the handwriting, but the accountant's sworn statement silenced the argument. Each exhibit landed like a quiet blow. I could see Sabrina's confidence fading with each piece of proof. Her face stiffened, her composure cracking at the edges. When the hearing paused for recess, I walked past Sabrina without saying a word. She didn't look at me this time. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clasped tightly around her purse. I felt no anger anymore, just certainty. The truth was working on its own now. I stepped outside, letting the sunlight hit my face. For the first time since the funeral, the world didn't feel small or heavy. It felt open, full of air. Whatever came next, I knew she could no longer rewrite my story. The real will had already done what it was meant to do. The second day in court began with witnesses. Monica called Ruth first. She spoke with calm authority, explaining how she uncovered the irregular payments and verified that Sabrina's consulting company didn't exist. The judge listened carefully, nodding as she flipped through the documents. Sabrina's lawyer objected twice, but the evidence stood firm. I watched from my seat, keeping my face still. Inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Validation. My husband's lies were no longer protected by charm or money. The truth had its own rhythm now, slow but certain, and it was working in my favor. When Sabrina took the stand, she tried to present herself as a victim. She spoke about her years of dedication to my husband's company, how they shared mutual respect. Her voice carried practiced sincerity, but her eyes kept darting to the evidence pile in front of the judge. Monica asked calm, direct questions. Each answer from Sabrina made her story weaker. When Monica presented the document, showing her as the beneficiary of company funds, the room fell quiet. Sabrina froze for a moment. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. I could almost see the foundation of her story start to crumble. Ethan was called next. Watching him walk to the stand was harder than I expected. He looked tired, pale, and conflicted. Monica asked if he knew about the second will. He said he didn't. She asked if he knew about Sabrina's financial involvement with his father. He hesitated, then said he believed everything was legitimate. It was clear he was trying to protect the memory of his father, but the judge saw through it. His vague answers didn't help Sabrina's side. I felt a pang of sadness, not triumph. My son was still lost between love and truth. By the end of that day, both sides had presented their arguments. Monica had built an unshakable case. The opposing lawyer looked drained. Sabrina avoided everyone's eyes as she left the courtroom, her confidence gone. I stayed seated for a moment after everyone left. The silence inside the courtroom was strange, peaceful but heavy with finality. I realized the outcome didn't matter as much as I thought. I had already won by bringing everything to light. Still, I hoped justice would confirm what I already knew. That night, I slept deeply, as if years of weight had finally lifted. 2 weeks later, the verdict was scheduled. I spent the waiting days cleaning the house, putting away old memories. The simple act of sweeping and folding felt like reclaiming control. Each drawer I organized seemed to remove another layer of pain. I even found an old photo of me and my husband from our early years. He looked young, full of ambition. I didn't feel hatred anymore, only distance. Sometimes people destroy others without realizing how permanent the damage is. I put the photo in a box, not out of love, but to mark that chapter as officially closed. On the morning of the verdict, I arrived early again. The courtroom filled quickly this time. Reporters waited outside, sensing a story worth printing. Sabrina entered with her lawyer, her face pale and tight. Ethan followed behind. Slower, his expression unreadable. When the judge began to read the decision, my heart stayed calm. The ruling confirmed that Sabrina's version of the will was invalid. The original document, the one I had found, was recognized as the true and legal testament. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sabrina's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Her world had collapsed in a few short sentences. The judge continued reading, outlining how Sabrina had manipulated company funds and forged records. She was ordered to return every asset she gained through deceit, including the properties and financial transfers. The total was immense. Ethan's shoulders slumped. He stared at the floor as the judge spoke, realizing how much he had been deceived as well. When the session ended, I didn't move right away. I watched Sabrina gather her things with shaking hands. No tears, no anger, just quiet defeat. It was strange how victory didn't feel loud. It felt still, like standing in the eye of a long storm. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, and reporters called my name. I kept walking, ignoring them. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth had already been spoken where it mattered. Ruth met me by the steps, with a soft smile. She said she was proud of me. I thanked her, not with words, but with a hug. It felt like the first honest touch I'd shared in months. Monica approached next, calm as always, and told me I could finally move forward. Her words sounded simple, but they carried weight. For the first time, I truly believed them. The following days were quiet. Sabrina's name appeared in local papers, labeled as the woman who tried to rewrite a family story. Her reputation crumbled overnight. Her company shut down, her assets frozen. Ethan didn't reach out immediately, but I knew he would eventually. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was space for truth to settle. I spent time tending to the small garden behind the house. The earth felt soft, forgiving. I hadn't realized how much I missed working with my hands. Each plant I watered felt like a reminder that something broken can still grow again. One afternoon, I drove to the beach house. It was officially mine again. The air smelled of salt and rain. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust covered everything, but the structure stood firm. I opened the windows, letting light pour through. The sound of the ocean filled the space, gentle and steady. I walked from room to room, remembering summers spent here, long before betrayal clouded it all. I whispered to myself that this was no longer a place of loss. It was a new beginning, shaped by truth, not lies. I felt lighter walking out. When I returned home, I found an envelope in the mailbox. It was from Ethan. My hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note, asking to meet. He wanted to talk, to understand. I sat at the kitchen table, reading it again. The handwriting looked strained, but genuine. I thought of ignoring it, but I couldn't. He was still my son, even if he had chosen the wrong side. Maybe the truth had finally reached him. I decided to meet him at the same cafe where he used to eat pastries as a boy. It felt fitting somehow. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Ethan was already there, sitting by the window. His eyes looked tired, softer than before. For a while we sat in silence, just watching people walk by outside. He finally spoke, admitting he had been wrong about Sabrina. He said he felt ashamed for doubting me. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. Hearing him take responsibility felt like air returning to a room long closed. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I told him forgiveness wasn't a gift. It was a process, and for the first time I meant it. We began to meet regularly after that. Small steps at first. Short visits, quiet meals, shared updates about work and life. He started dropping by the house again, fixing little things, tightening loose screws, replacing bulbs, repainting a wall. Each act spoke louder than words. Slowly, the distance began to fade. I knew trust wouldn't rebuild overnight, but it didn't need to. It just needed effort. One afternoon, he brought me flowers, the same kind I used to plant when he was little. I didn't say much, just placed them in a vase. It was enough. The silence felt healed. As months passed, the noise around the court case died down. People moved on to other stories. My name wasn't in the papers anymore, and I preferred it that way. I returned to simple routines, reading in the mornings, walking by the park, cooking my own meals. The calm felt strange at first, but soon it became comforting. I realized how long I had lived in chaos disguised as normalcy. Peace didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed space, and I finally had that space back. My life was quiet, but it was mine again, entirely and completely. One morning, while clearing a drawer, I found an old notebook filled with budget notes from years ago. My handwriting looked younger, more hopeful. I flipped through pages of meal plans, expenses, and savings goals. Back then, I believed every decision was a shared effort. I smiled faintly, realizing how blind I had been. Yet, I didn't feel regret. That woman was doing her best with what she knew. I decided not to throw it away. Instead, I kept it as a reminder, proof that my loyalty wasn't foolishness. It was strength that others simply didn't know how to value. Ruth visited me one weekend, bringing homemade pie and her usual humor. We sat on the porch, talking about small things, gardens, weather, books. She said it was good to see me smiling again. I told her I was learning how to enjoy quiet moments. She laughed softly and said, "That's when healing really begins." Watching the sun dip below the trees, I realized she was right. I didn't need closure in grand gestures. It was in moments like these, shared laughter, steady air, and peace, that didn't depend on anyone's approval. I was starting to feel whole again. Months turned into a year. Sabrina left town, selling whatever assets remained. Ethan told me she tried contacting him once, but he didn't respond. Her chapter in our lives was over. The company my husband once ran was now under new management, distant from the past. I had no desire to look back anymore. One evening, I walked to the cemetery and placed a single flower on my husband's grave. I didn't speak or cry. I just stood there, thinking about how love, betrayal, and truth could all exist in one life. I walked away lighter, not bitter. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic financial literacy to women starting over after divorce or loss. The work filled me with purpose again. Many of them shared stories of giving everything to a marriage only to be left with nothing. Listening to them felt familiar, but instead of pain, I felt connection. Helping them build independence made my own scars feel useful. Each class ended with laughter and hope. It reminded me that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about rebuilding in a way that no one can take from you again. Sometimes at night, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and look out at the streetlights. The world was quiet, but my mind was at peace. I thought of how much had changed, how grief turned into strength and loss turned into clarity. The woman who once felt invisible had become her own defender. I didn't need recognition from anyone. The truth itself was enough. The house around me no longer felt haunted by betrayal. It felt steady again, like a safe shell for a life finally reclaimed from the shadows of others' choices. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by with his girlfriend. She was kind, polite, and respectful. I watched how he treated her, with gentleness and care. I realized he had learned something from everything that happened. Before they left, he hugged me longer than usual. It wasn't just affection, it was gratitude. I didn't need words to understand it. As they drove away, I felt a deep sense of calm. The past had finally stopped echoing in my life. All that remained was quiet truth, and the strength to live freely. Justice had done its part. The rest belonged to peace. Seasons changed again, and with them came a steady rhythm. I found new joy in simple habits: morning walks, planting herbs, writing short reflections in a journal. The act of writing helped me see patterns in my past, how silence had been my cage. But now, each page was a declaration of freedom. I began to fill the journal with gratitude rather than grief. There was power in ordinary moments, something I had missed for years. Healing, I learned, didn't come with grand celebrations. It arrived quietly, through persistence and gentle acceptance of what cannot be changed. The following spring, I attended a local event for retired professionals. Many people remembered me from my old career. They asked why I disappeared all those years ago. I simply said life had its detours. One woman, younger than the rest, asked if I ever regretted stepping away. I told her I used to, but not anymore. Everything I lost taught me what peace really means. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange pride. I had lived through ruin and rebuilt something honest from the remains. That was enough. I kept the second will in a safe box, stored high on the shelf. Sometimes I took it out, not to relive pain, but to remember how close I came to losing myself. That paper had been my turning point. It reminded me that truth is quiet, but indestructible. Whenever doubt crept in, I would open the box, look at it, and smile. It wasn't just a document. It was a promise to never forget my worth again. I locked it back carefully each time, feeling grateful that I had found courage exactly when the world thought I had none left. Ethan and I developed a new kind of relationship, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. He began visiting more often, not out of guilt, but choice. We talked about small things: his work, his future plans. Sometimes he'd ask about my younger days, and I'd tell him stories of ambition and laughter. He said he never realized how capable I had been before marriage. I smiled and told him I was rediscovering that woman. Seeing admiration in his eyes again healed something I didn't know was still broken. The distance that once felt permanent was now completely gone. Looking back, I understood that every loss had led me to this version of myself. Betrayal stripped away illusions, but in doing so, revealed a strength I didn't know existed. The woman who once depended on others now depended on no one's approval. I still visited the ocean sometimes, standing where the waves met the shore, remembering the silence of that first day after the funeral, but it no longer hurt. The past had done its work. I was still here, whole, steady, and free, and that was the ending they never expected me to have. As another year passed, I found myself breathing easier. The chaos that once filled my mind was gone, replaced by quiet stability. I started spending time in the backyard every morning, watching the sunlight move across the garden. I learned that peace wasn't something you waited for, it was something you created. Ethan sometimes joined me for coffee before work, sitting silently beside me. Those shared moments said more than words ever could. I didn't need grand apologies or promises. His presence alone reminded me that love, when rebuilt honestly, could be stronger than before. It just needed patience. One weekend, Ethan asked if I would visit the community center where he volunteered. It turned out he had started helping with financial workshops, inspired by the stories I told him. Watching him explain budgeting to younger people filled me with quiet pride. He had learned empathy from what we endured. I stood at the back of the room, unnoticed by most, and smiled. Life had a way of coming full circle. The same lessons I taught myself through loss were now being passed forward through him. That realization was more rewarding than any legal victory I ever had. When I returned home that day, I sat on the porch with a notebook. I started writing everything I had learned. The mistakes, the warnings, the truths. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but I wanted to leave behind something real. Not a story of tragedy, but of survival. Each page reminded me how far I had come from the woman who once sat quietly in the back of a funeral, invisible to everyone. Now, I was the author of my own ending, and it felt steady, not vengeful. I was finally living on my own terms. A letter from Monica arrived in the mail, summarizing the final settlement. Everything Sabrina had stolen had been returned, including the funds and the properties. I signed a few remaining documents and closed the chapter for good. I didn't feel the urge to celebrate. Some battles didn't end with applause. They ended with quiet acceptance. I placed the folder neatly in my cabinet, beside the will. Then I brewed a cup of tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the street. The world looked ordinary again, and for the first time I was grateful for the ordinary. Ruth invited me to a small reunion with old colleagues from the firm. I hesitated at first, but decided to go. The event was at a cozy restaurant downtown, filled with laughter and stories of old office days. People were surprised to see me. Some apologized for losing touch after I left my job. I didn't hold any resentment. Life moves people in different directions. When I spoke about my current work helping women regain control over their finances, they listened intently. It felt strange, being admired again. I realized I hadn't lost my voice. It had just been waiting. As the night ended, Ruth raised a toast in my honor, calling me the bravest woman she knew. Everyone clapped. I smiled, humbled but calm. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt human. For years, I had been invisible because I allowed myself to disappear into someone else's shadow. Now, I stood fully in the light, comfortable with who I was. On the drive home, I played soft music and watched the city lights pass by. I didn't think about revenge or regret anymore. I only thought about how peace always feels earned, never gifted. Months later, Ethan told me he planned to buy a small apartment closer to my home. He said he wanted to stay nearby, to visit often. I nodded, hiding my emotion behind a smile. After everything that happened, this gesture meant more than any apology. It wasn't about dependence, It was about connection. I helped him look through listings, the same way I once helped him with school forms and job applications. Life had shifted, but our bond was returning to something real. This time, it wasn't built on expectation, but mutual understanding and quiet respect. One evening, Ethan came over with old photo albums he found in storage. We sat together flipping through the pages, laughing at old pictures. It felt good to remember the past without pain. For years, those memories had been tied to betrayal. Now they simply belonged to our family again. We talked late into the night until the house felt warm again, filled with something I thought I'd lost forever. When he left, he hugged me and said he'd come again next week. I stood at the doorway long after he left, smiling to myself in the quiet. The following week, I received a message from Monica inviting me to speak at a local legal forum about my experience. She said my story had inspired her team. I agreed, though the idea made me nervous. On the day of the event, I stood before a small audience of lawyers and community members. I told them about the importance of awareness, trust, and financial independence. I didn't dramatize anything. I just told the truth. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. I felt proud, not for the past, but for surviving it. After the event, a young woman approached me. She said she had gone through something similar and didn't know how to start over. I told her it begins with one step, a decision to choose yourself again. She smiled through tears and thanked me. Walking out of that building, I realized that healing isn't just personal. When you share it, it becomes something bigger. My pain had turned into someone else's map. That thought filled me with calm joy. The story that once broke me had started building strength in others. That was a victory I hadn't expected. Spring arrived again, filling the air with warmth and new beginnings. The garden bloomed brighter than ever. Ethan came over one weekend and helped me repaint the fence. We worked quietly, side by side, the way families should. Later, we shared dinner on the porch, talking about his future. He told me he wanted to travel, to see the world. I encouraged him, proud that he was dreaming again. Watching him smile under the golden light, I realized I had raised him well after all. Mistakes didn't erase love. They only tested its strength, and ours had endured everything. On a quiet afternoon, I took a drive to the countryside. I stopped by a field where wildflowers grew freely. I walked for a while, breathing in the open air. The stillness around me wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I thought about how far I had come from that broken woman at the funeral. She had lost everything but found herself in return. I picked one wildflower and placed it in my car. It reminded me that life doesn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. It just needs honesty and the will to start again after every fall. When I got home, I noticed the sunlight spilling through the living room window, landing on the same spot where I once cried after learning about the will. I stood there for a while, letting the light touch my hands. The pain that once filled this house had become a quiet kind of gratitude. I no longer needed to prove anyone wrong. The truth had already done that. Now I lived only to prove to myself that joy could exist after ruin. It didn't come all at once, but it came, and that was enough. I began keeping small traditions to remind myself of renewal. Every Sunday, I baked bread, just like I used to when Ethan was young. The smell filled the house and carried memories of laughter and simpler days. I also started writing letters to my younger self, telling her everything I wish she had known, that love should never cost self-worth, and silence isn't peace. I never mailed them, but they helped me heal parts of myself that words alone couldn't reach. Each letter ended the same way: "You are enough." Reading them felt like forgiveness I had long waited for. Ethan surprised me with a birthday celebration that summer. He invited Ruth and Monica, turning it into a small gathering. The table was filled with simple food, laughter, and stories. At one point, Ethan raised a toast, thanking me for teaching him what strength really looks like. My eyes stung, but I smiled. I didn't need grand declarations. This quiet acknowledgement meant everything. That night, as everyone left, I stood by the doorway watching them walk to their cars. I realized my life had come full circle, broken, rebuilt, and beautiful in its simplicity. I finally felt complete. After that evening, I started teaching financial classes regularly at the community center, each session filled with women eager to learn, to regain control after years of dependence. I saw my old self in their faces, the confusion, the quiet pain, and the slow return of confidence. I helped them create budgets, read contracts, and understand their worth. Every class ended with laughter and stories of progress. One woman told me she finally opened her own bank account after years of fear. I drove home smiling that night, realizing healing grows stronger when shared with others who need it. One morning I received a postcard from Sabrina. It was unexpected. There were no apologies, only a few vague words about moving abroad to start over. I read it twice, unsure why she sent it. Then I tore it in half and threw it away. Her story no longer mattered. She had already taken enough space in my life. I wasn't angry, just done. Sometimes closure doesn't come through confrontation. It comes when you stop caring, and that's what I felt. Indifference. It was freedom disguised as calm, and it was the most powerful feeling I'd ever known. I took a weekend trip to the coast by myself. The same beach where so many lies were built now felt pure again. I walked along the shoreline, letting the cold waves reach my feet. The house nearby stood quietly, empty, and mine again. I didn't need to live there, but I was glad it still existed as proof that truth had won. The sound of the waves was steady, not sorrowful. I sat down on the sand and smiled. I had spent years surviving storms. Now I was learning to enjoy the calm that followed. Back home, I decided to redecorate the living room. I painted the walls a lighter color, added new curtains, and replaced old photographs with new ones of me and Ethan. It wasn't just about change, it was about reclaiming space. Every corner now reflected who I was, not who I used to be. When Ethan visited, he said the house felt brighter. I told him it finally matched the peace I felt inside. That night, I sat in the armchair by the window, reading a book. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore. It was earned, warm, and deeply mine. I found my old resume tucked away in a folder one afternoon. I laughed reading it. It felt like meeting a version of myself that had been frozen in time. I decided to update it, just for fun. A week later, I applied for a part-time position teaching finance at a local college. They hired me almost immediately. Standing in front of a classroom again felt natural. The students listened with focus, and I felt alive. My mind stayed sharp, my words confident. I realized I hadn't lost my abilities. I had only hidden them under years of someone else's shadow. My first paycheck in years arrived in the mail. I held it for a while before cashing it. It wasn't the amount that mattered, it was what it symbolized: independence. I treated myself to a new coat, soft gray wool like the one I wore at my husband's funeral, but lighter, freer. It wasn't closure, it was renewal. I looked in the mirror that evening and barely recognized myself. I wasn't the quiet wife anymore. I was the woman who rebuilt her life from the ground up. I finally liked the reflection staring back at me. She looked unbreakable. Ethan came to visit the next weekend. We had dinner together and talked about everything: his job, my classes, the future. He asked if I ever regretted exposing the truth. I told him no. Regret comes when you choose silence, not when you choose honesty. He nodded, understanding. Before leaving, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a framed photo of us standing outside the courthouse after the trial, smiling. He said it belonged on the wall. I placed it near the doorway. It reminded me daily that truth doesn't destroy families, it rebuilds them the right way. Time passed softly. I began hosting small dinners for friends and students, filling the house with laughter again. The rooms that once echoed with sadness now carried warmth. Ruth visited often, always bringing pie and news about her grandchildren. Monica sent me postcards from her travels. Life had become steady, grounded. I didn't crave excitement anymore. I craved stability, honesty, and moments that felt real. When I lay down each night, I didn't replay old arguments or betrayals. I just listened to the quiet and felt peace. For the first time, the quiet didn't frighten me, it comforted me. One morning, I woke up before sunrise and went for a walk. The streets were empty, the air cool and calm. As I passed by houses with their lights still off, I thought about all the women who wake up early to hold their worlds together, unseen and unappreciated. I used to be one of them. Now, I carried no resentment, just understanding. Every unseen effort, every quiet sacrifice had led me here. When the sun rose over the rooftops, I smiled. I wasn't invisible anymore, even if no one was watching. I finally saw myself clearly. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened the notebook where I'd been writing my reflections. I added one final line: "Justice doesn't erase pain, it teaches strength." I closed it and placed it beside the framed photo of me and Ethan. The room was filled with warm light, and I felt calm, knowing my story had found its peace. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The truth had done its work. What remained was quiet pride. I leaned back in my chair and breathed deeply, content with the life I had finally reclaimed. One afternoon, I received an email from the college administration asking if I would mentor a group of young women preparing for a financial awareness seminar. I accepted immediately. Watching their determination reminded me of my younger self, full of hope and energy. They asked questions about life, money, and trust, and I answered each one honestly. I told them mistakes don't define you. They reveal where you stopped listening to yourself. Their smiles reminded me why teaching mattered. It wasn't about textbooks. It was about giving others the tools to protect themselves from the silence I once lived in. After the seminar, one of the students handed me a small note that said, "You make me believe life can start over." I folded it carefully and kept it in my wallet. That single sentence meant more than any award. It was proof that my pain had turned into purpose. I walked home feeling light, almost joyful. The wind brushed through my hair, and I realized how strange it felt to walk without carrying weight on my shoulders. The past was no longer a shadow following me. It had become the ground beneath the new path I was walking. The next weekend, Ethan invited me to his apartment for dinner. He cooked a simple meal, nervous but proud. His place was modest and clean, full of small touches that reminded me of home flowers on the table, framed photos, warm lighting. We talked about ordinary things: work, neighbors, small daily annoyances. The conversation flowed easily. I noticed how peaceful he looked. For years, I had worried that bitterness might take root in him, but it hadn't. He had found balance. As I left that night, he hugged me tightly. It felt like a quiet promise that we had both healed. That night, I couldn't sleep, but not because of worry. I stayed awake thinking about how far we had come. The road from betrayal to peace had been long, but every painful step had meaning now. I realized that closure wasn't something you waited for, it was something you built brick by brick. I no longer felt like a victim, or even a survivor. I felt like a builder, shaping my life intentionally this time. Lying in bed, I smiled into the dark, thankful that even after all the ruin, I had found a way to feel whole again. A few months later, I received a letter from the law firm confirming the final settlement distribution. Every asset was now legally under my name. The process was finally complete. I placed the letter inside my safe and exhaled deeply. The paper wasn't just proof of ownership, it was a certificate of freedom. My years of silence had been replaced by a single truth written in ink. I went for a walk afterward, feeling calm as I passed the familiar streets. Everything looked the same, yet I saw it differently. Nothing outside had changed, but I had completely transformed. As the months rolled on, my days took on a gentle rhythm. Mornings were for classes, afternoons for reading, and evenings for reflection. The predictability felt soothing. I sometimes wondered what my husband would think if he could see me now independent, steady, and content. Maybe he would have been surprised, maybe even proud, but I didn't need his approval anymore. The woman who once waited for validation from others now gave it to herself. I learned that the truest revenge wasn't anger or triumph, it was peace that no one could take away again. Ruth called one evening to tell me she was moving closer to her daughter. She said she wanted to spend her last years surrounded by family. I was happy for her but knew I'd miss her company. We met for one final dinner before her move, talking about everything we had been through. She said I had taught her as much as she taught me. We laughed at that, clinking our glasses softly. When we hugged goodbye, I felt gratitude more than sadness. People like her appear in your life at the right moment, and she had been my anchor. After Ruth left, the house felt a little emptier, but not lonely. I started spending more evenings at the community center, helping organize charity events. The laughter and energy there filled the quiet spaces of my days. I had built a new circle of friends, women who admired my resilience and found strength in each other. Together, we shared food, stories, and lessons that life had taught us through hardship. It wasn't the life I once imagined, but it was full and meaningful. I had stopped chasing perfection long ago. I just wanted peace, and I had finally found it. One day, while organizing old files, I came across the original copy of the forged will. I stared at it for a moment, remembering how powerless it once made me feel. Now it was nothing more than paper, stripped of its threat. I decided to burn it. I placed it in the fireplace, struck a match, and watched as the edges curled and turned black. The flames consumed every lie it carried. When it was gone, I felt lighter. It wasn't about revenge. It was about release. The fire didn't just erase a document, it erased the last trace of fear. That night, I sat outside under the stars. The air was cool, and the quiet stretched wide. I realized that for the first time in decades, I had no battles left to fight. There was no more noise, no secrets waiting to be uncovered, no apologies I still wanted to hear, just peace. I leaned back, letting the night air fill my lungs, and felt grateful. Healing hadn't been a single moment. It had been 1,000 small ones like this. The world around me was calm, and for the first time so was I. As time moved forward, my classes at the college became popular. More students signed up each term, curious to learn not only about money, but about resilience. They often told me my lessons felt personal. I didn't hide my story. I shared pieces of it to remind them that control over your life begins with awareness. When the semester ended, the students surprised me with a card full of notes thanking me. Reading their words brought tears to my eyes. I had once been silenced by shame. Now, my voice was helping others find their own strength again. Ethan invited me on a short trip to the mountains that summer. We rented a small cabin surrounded by pine trees and quiet trails. The simplicity of it reminded me of the early years of motherhood, before life got complicated. We spent our days hiking, cooking, and watching sunsets. On the last night, we sat by the fire and talked about everything that happened. He said the past had changed him too. I told him that's what pain does. It transforms if you let it. When we left the next morning, I felt like we had both started new lives together. Returning home from that trip, I noticed how different the house felt now. It no longer reminded me of the past, but of the peace I had created. The furniture, the walls, the photos, all carried stories of growth. I decided to host a small gathering for my friends from the community center. We shared food, laughter, and music. Someone asked how I stayed so calm after everything I went through. I told them peace doesn't come from forgetting pain, it comes from facing it until it stops controlling you. They nodded quietly. That night, I slept without a single worry. I started journaling again, but this time it wasn't about loss. I wrote about gratitude, the joy of simple mornings, the comfort of friendship, the quiet pride of self-reliance. Writing these thoughts helped me realize how much beauty exists in ordinary days. Each entry became a reminder that healing isn't linear, but it's always possible. Some mornings, I'd reread earlier pages and smile at how far I'd come. I had learned to celebrate stability, not excitement. My peace no longer depended on others. It lived quietly inside me, where no betrayal could ever reach again. During one of my morning walks, I passed by a small bookstore I hadn't noticed before. On impulse, I went in. The owner was an elderly man who loved hearing people's stories. When I told him a little about mine, he suggested I write a book. I laughed at first, but the idea lingered. Maybe my story could help others, the way sharing had helped me. I bought a blank notebook and promised myself I'd start. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about leaving behind a trace of truth that could outlive the pain that created it. I began writing every evening. The words flowed easily, not from anger, but from clarity. I wrote about betrayal, discovery, and the long road back to self-respect. The story felt familiar yet distant, like reading someone else's life. Sometimes, I'd stop mid-sentence to think about how different I had become. The woman in those pages was no longer me. She was someone I had survived. The act of writing wasn't just reflection, it was release. Each page made me lighter, stronger, and more grateful for the peace I had fought to earn. The pen became my quiet companion. Months later, I printed a few copies of the book and shared them privately with close friends and students. They read it and said it gave them courage. One student told me her mother cried while reading it, saying she finally felt seen. That made every sleepless night worth it. I didn't need to sell thousands of copies. Knowing that my story helped even one person feel less alone was enough. The book wasn't about the pain, it was about what came after. And seeing it in someone else's hands made me realize healing can ripple far beyond your own life. Ethan read the book too. When he finished, he called me, his voice full of emotion. He said he never understood how deeply I had been hurt until he read those words. I told him it wasn't written to make him feel guilty. It was written so neither of us would forget what we overcame. Later that week, he visited with flowers and told me he was proud of me. We sat outside, laughing like old friends. The distance that once felt unbridgeable was gone. Our bond had been rebuilt, stronger and honest, with no lies left between us. One evening, while cleaning my office, I found the last copy of the book draft. I held it for a long moment before deciding to donate it to the local library. It felt right. My story had started in silence and ended in truth. It belonged in a place meant for learning. When I handed it to the librarian, she smiled and said stories like mine reminded people that strength isn't loud. I thanked her and walked out feeling calm. I had finally let my story go. It no longer needed protection. It could live freely, just like me. Time continued moving softly. My hair turned fully gray, and I stopped trying to hide it. I began embracing everything. Age gave me wisdom, calm, and patience. People often said I looked peaceful, and they were right. I no longer lived waiting for something to change. Life didn't need to be extraordinary to feel fulfilling. One morning, as I watched the sunrise through my kitchen window, I realized I had created a life built on truth. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and after everything I had survived, real was all I ever wanted. Ethan eventually got married. His wedding was small and beautiful. I watched him exchange vows with a woman who looked at him the way I once hoped to be looked at, with respect and warmth. During the reception, he pulled me aside and thanked me for teaching him what love truly means. His words felt like a full circle. The pain I once thought had destroyed us had in truth taught him how to build better. Watching them dance together, I felt no sadness, just quiet pride that the cycle of deceit had ended with me, not continued beyond. After the wedding, I returned home and looked around the living room where so much had changed. The house had aged, but it still felt alive, like me. I made tea and sat in my favorite chair, reflecting on everything that had brought me here. The woman who once cried over betrayal was now unshaken. I had learned to live with truth instead of pretending. The peace inside these walls was my reward. I didn't need anyone else to witness it. I just sat there, smiling quietly, knowing I had finally learned how to live in full contentment. Years passed, and the garden outside grew thicker with flowers and trees. I spent most mornings tending to it, hands in the soil, sunlight on my face. Sometimes I thought about my husband, not with anger but distance. He was a part of my story, not its author. I had taken back the pen long ago. The wind would carry the scent of roses, and I'd breathe it in, grateful for every scar that led me here. Life had taught me that pain is temporary, but the strength it builds can last forever if you choose to honor it. Ethan visited often with his wife and their newborn daughter. Watching him hold his child filled me with warmth I hadn't felt in years. I saw tenderness in his eyes, the kind of love that protects rather than controls. He asked me to teach his daughter when she grows older about money and strength, about how to stand tall even when life tries to break you. I promised I would. Seeing him as a father made me realize that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating a better one for those who come next. That night, after they left, I sat by the window holding my granddaughter's small photo. I looked around the room, the books, the plants, the calm. Every piece of it carried a story, and every story led back to the same truth. Betrayal may have started my journey, but it never defined it. What defined me was endurance, grace, and quiet strength. I placed the photo on the shelf beside my favorite book and turned off the light. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful, like the end of a long, hard chapter, finally ready to rest. The following morning, sunlight poured through the curtains, soft and golden. I walked into the garden barefoot, feeling the cool grass beneath my feet. The world felt quiet, but alive. I thought about how far I'd come, from the forgotten wife at a funeral to a woman who had built peace with her own hands. Every leaf, every flower around me seemed to carry proof that healing is possible. I knelt down and planted a new rosebush near the fence. It was a simple act, but to me, it meant one thing: I was still growing. Later that day, I sat at my desk and looked through old photo albums one last time. I didn't feel sadness anymore, only gratitude for the life that shaped me. The laughter, the mistakes, the betrayals, they were all part of the same long journey toward becoming who I am. I closed the album carefully and placed it in a drawer. Some stories don't need to be erased. They just need to rest. As I looked out the window, the sky turned pale pink, and I realized I had stopped living in the past completely. I was fully here now. That weekend, I hosted a family dinner at my house. Ethan, his wife, and the baby came early to help set the table. The sound of clinking dishes and quiet laughter filled the house. For years, I had dreaded gatherings because they reminded me of what was missing. Now, they reminded me of what had returned. When everyone sat down to eat, I looked around the table. This was the family I had fought for, not through anger, but through truth. The walls that once held grief now held love again, strong and genuine, the way it should have always been. During dessert, Ethan asked about the old will, the one that started it all. I told him I kept it locked away, not out of anger, but as a reminder of what truth can protect. He nodded, understanding. Then his wife asked how I managed to stay calm through everything. I told her, peace isn't something you find. It's something you decide to keep, even when the world tries to take it. The table grew quiet, and I saw them both take in the words. It felt like passing down something more valuable than money, a lesson carved from survival. After everyone left, I stood at the doorway for a while, listening to the faint echo of their laughter fading down the street. The house was quiet again, but not empty. It carried warmth that stayed even after the people left. I cleaned the dishes slowly, humming a song I hadn't sung in years. I didn't realize until then how peaceful routine could be when you're not living for someone else's approval. Every small task felt sacred now, a reminder that life didn't need to be extraordinary to feel complete. It only needed honesty and care. The next morning, I received a letter from the community center. They wanted to name their new scholarship program after me. I sat at the table, reading it twice. The words felt surreal. For years, I had been invisible, my efforts overlooked. Now, people were recognizing the quiet strength I had always carried. I smiled and accepted their offer. The scholarship would help women rebuild after financial loss. It felt right. My story, once built on betrayal, was now becoming a foundation for others to stand on. That was the kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. At the scholarship event, I spoke to a small crowd of students and volunteers. I didn't use fancy words. I just told them the truth, that rebuilding starts the moment you stop waiting for someone to save you. When I finished, the audience applauded softly. A few women came up afterward to thank me, saying they finally felt hope again. Their gratitude touched me deeply. For years, I had lived without purpose. Now every choice I made seemed to ripple outward, helping others find light in places that once felt impossible. It was the best reward I could imagine. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sky fade into twilight. The sound of crickets filled the air. I thought about the long chain of moments that had brought me here, the heartbreak, the courtroom, the long nights alone. Each one had felt unbearable back then, yet each had shaped me into someone unshakable. I no longer wished the past had gone differently. Without it, I wouldn't understand the peace I had now. I sipped my tea slowly, smiling at the thought. Sometimes, life doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to be understood. A few days later, I received an unexpected visit from Monica. She said she was retiring and wanted to thank me personally. She told me that my case had changed the way she approached her work. It reminded her that truth is not always loud, but it's always persistent. We talked for hours about life, choices, and how women often forget their own strength until they're forced to remember it. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly and said I had become one of her favorite victories. I smiled, knowing she had been one of mine too. After she left, I looked around the quiet house and realized it no longer felt too big for one person. Every corner carried a story of perseverance. I had outgrown the sadness that once lived here. Instead of trying to fill the silence, I embraced it. It was my peace, my reflection, my reminder of survival. I decided to keep the house exactly as it was, a symbol of endurance. I didn't need to move or start over somewhere new. This was home, not because it was perfect, but because I had turned pain into comfort within its walls. Ethan and his wife started visiting every weekend, bringing the baby who was learning to walk. Watching her tiny steps across the living room filled me with joy. I saw in her the start of something pure, untouched by deceit or pain. One afternoon, she stumbled toward me, holding out her hand for balance. I caught her gently, laughing. That small gesture felt symbolic. A new generation was learning trust again, in the same home where lies once lived. Life had repaired itself quietly, as it always does when truth is allowed to breathe. I felt complete in that moment. As the months went by, I noticed my energy slowing, but my spirit stayed strong. I spent more time writing letters to Ethan and his daughter for the future. I wanted them to remember my lessons long after I was gone. I wrote about courage, forgiveness, and the importance of protecting one's integrity. Each letter ended with the same words: truth is the only inheritance that never loses its value. Writing them didn't feel sad. It felt like preparing seeds to be planted long after I was gone. That thought brought me quiet comfort and pride. One afternoon, I visited the cemetery again. The air was cool, and the trees swayed softly. I brought no flowers this time, only peace. Standing before my husband's grave, I didn't feel bitterness anymore. I whispered a quiet thank you, not for the betrayal, but for the lessons it forced me to learn. Without the pain, I might never have found myself again. I turned and walked away slowly, feeling the sun warm my face. It was the first time I left that place without tears. The past had finally released me completely. That evening, I cooked dinner just for myself and set the table with care. I lit a candle and sat down, savoring the meal. The sound of the clock ticking was steady and gentle. I thought about how strange it was that life could be both simple and meaningful at the same time. There was no noise, no chaos, no pretending, just peace. I realized I had become everything I once needed: strong, safe, and content. I raised my glass slightly, not in a toast to the past, but to the quiet joy of living freely. The following week, I went through my belongings, keeping only what mattered most: old clothes, unused dishes, meaningless souvenirs. I donated them all. What remained were small, meaningful things: the real will, family photos, and the letters I wrote for Ethan's daughter. Clearing the clutter felt symbolic. It wasn't just about space, it was about closure. Every item I let go of made the air feel lighter. I realized that moving forward doesn't always mean adding new things. Sometimes it means releasing what no longer serves your peace, and that was the simplest kind of freedom. One evening, Ethan stopped by unannounced. He brought takeout and a movie. We sat together, laughing at scenes that weren't even that funny. It was ordinary, but that's what made it special. Years ago, I had prayed for moments like this: quiet, uncomplicated, honest. Before he left, he hugged me and said he was grateful I never gave up on him. I told him I never gave up on either of us. As he drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. The family I had once lost was now whole again in its own quiet way. The next morning, I sat at my writing desk, sunlight spilling across the papers. I started writing one final note for my journal. I wrote that peace isn't found in winning or revenge. It's found when you stop needing closure from others. I smiled as I finished the sentence. Every word felt earned. I closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer beside the will. It wasn't a record of pain anymore. It was a record of triumph. I realized I had lived the second half of my life, not as a reaction, but as a choice, and it was enough. That afternoon, a soft breeze moved through the open window, carrying the scent of roses. I took it as a small reminder that beauty always finds its way back after storms. I walked outside and stood among the flowers. The garden was alive with color, full of life I had nurtured myself. I thought about the first rose bush I planted after finding the real will. It had grown strong, blooming brighter than the others. It felt like a symbol of everything I had built: quiet strength, rooted deeply in truth. I smiled, feeling its meaning settle gently in my heart. As evening fell, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. The sky turned gold, and then faded into violet. The wind carried distant laughter from neighbors. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sounds wash over me. The world felt peaceful, familiar, kind. For years, I had feared growing old alone. Now solitude felt like a friend, not an enemy. I wasn't lonely. I was surrounded by memories that no longer hurt. My story had started in loss, but ended in peace. That realization filled me with warmth that words couldn't fully describe. When night came, I walked through each room, turning off lights one by one. In the hallway, I stopped to look at the framed photo of me and Ethan from years ago. We were both smiling, carefree. I touched the glass lightly, whispering a silent thank you to the woman I used to be, the one who refused to stay broken. Every scar she carried had built this calm version of me. I turned off the last light and stood in the dark, not afraid of it. Darkness wasn't emptiness anymore. It was rest, earned after a long journey. The next morning, I woke early and went to the garden again. The roses glistened with dew, and the air felt crisp. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the fence, watching the sunrise. The colors painted the sky with warmth that felt alive. I thought about how every ending hides a quiet beginning. My story had started with betrayal, but had ended in freedom. The pain had burned away everything false, leaving only truth. I smiled softly, realizing that I no longer carried the past. It simply existed as proof of who I had become. Ethan arrived later that day with his daughter. She ran through the garden laughing, chasing butterflies. Watching her play filled my heart with peace. I realized that everything I had fought for, the truth, the strength, the lessons, would live on through her. She would grow up in a world where love wasn't built on silence or control, but respect and honesty. That was my legacy. Not wealth, not victory, but change. I knelt beside her, helping her pick a flower. In that moment, I knew my story had found its perfect ending, one built on truth and love. That evening, I sat alone once more, the house bathed in soft amber light. I felt no sadness, no longing, just deep fulfillment. The life that once fell apart had become whole again in a different form. I had learned that even when people try to erase you, truth always writes you back into the story. I looked toward the horizon through the window, watching the sky darken. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to prove. The peace I had found was unshakable, built not on what I gained, but on everything I finally let go of. The candle on my table flickered gently as I wrote one final note in my journal. I wrote, "The mistress believed she had outsmarted me, but she never understood one thing. Truth has its own timing." I smiled as I set the pen down. My story had started with humiliation, but it ended with grace. I had reclaimed every piece of my life that was taken. I blew out the candle, watching the thin line of smoke curl upward. It felt like a quiet goodbye to everything that once hurt me. All that remained was peace. I walked to the window and looked out at the night sky. The stars shimmered softly, scattered like promises kept. I thought of all the years behind me and felt no regret. My life had not been easy, but it had been real. I had lost love, trust, and even family, but I had found myself, and that was the greatest victory. I whispered a small thank you to the truth, to time, to endurance, and smiled. The world outside was calm, and so was I. The story was complete, and I had finally become the woman I was always meant to be.